You know, in the long history of warfare, there are a few names that just echo with this unique and terrible significance. And Stalingrad is absolutely one of them. This was never just a battle, it was a head-on collision of two totalitarian ideologies, and it was all fought in the frozen, shattered ruins of a single city. What happened here would fundamentally change the entire course of the Second World War. So today, we're going to dive deep into how this one single conflict became the definitive turning point on the brutal Eastern Front.
And if you really want to understand what it was like on the ground, just listen to these words from a Soviet soldier, written down by his own general. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. It's probably the most honest and direct description of the visceral, almost indescribable horror that was waiting for hundreds of thousands of men as they were fed into the meat grinder of Stalingrad.
So this is really the story of how one single, absolutely devastating battle on the banks of the Volga River became the moment the war on the Eastern Front pivoted. It was right here that the seemingly unstoppable German war machine wasn't just stopped in its tracks, it was completely and catastrophically broken.
Okay, but that raises the big question, right? Why Stalingrad? Of all the places in the Soviet Union, why this city? Well, to really get the battle, we first have to understand the massive strategic gamble that brought the German army all the way to the Volga in the first place.
See, the German summer offensive of 1942 had a code name, Case Blue or Fall Blau. And what's really interesting is that initially the plan had absolutely nothing to do with capturing the city of Stalingrad itself. The real goal was much more practical, a gigantic armored push across the southern steppes to grab the Soviet oil fields down in the Caucasus. Germany's war machine was incredibly thirsty, and Hitler knew that without that oil, his tanks and planes would eventually just grind to a halt.
In Hitler's own words here, wow, they just lay bare the incredibly high stakes he was playing for. He knew that the entire war effort hinged on this one offensive. This wasn't just some other battle. In his mind, it was the one move that would either win or lose him the entire war. The pressure to succeed was just immense.
And at first, man, it looked like this huge gamble was going to pay off big time. The offensive kicked off on June 28th, and the German advance was just a lightning-fast blur. Soviet forces seemed totally caught off guard. They were reeling backward across the huge open steppes. By late August, the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, had blitzed across hundreds of kilometers and was literally on the doorstep of Stalingrad with its sights on the Volga River.
And this brings us to the crucial and ultimately the fatal strategic decision. If the real prize was the oil fields way off to the south, why in the world would you divert a massive, powerful force like the Sixth Army to go take a city? Well, the answer seems to be inside the mind of Adolf Hitler. He was so high on the initial success that he personally intervened, ordering his army group south to split in two. One part would keep heading for the oil, while the other, the Sixth Army, was ordered to turn and capture Stalingrad. The city that was named after his arch-rival, Stalin, had become an obsession. It was a propaganda prize he just couldn't resist.
In that strategic shift, it would have absolutely horrific consequences. The war of fast-moving tanks across open plains was about to slam headfirst into the concrete and steel rubble of an industrial city. And it was going to transform into something way more primitive and way more brutal. So what happened was the German army ran into a tactical nightmare. Their entire way of war, the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was all built on speed, surprise, and the combined power of tanks, planes, and infantry working together in open country. But inside the ruins of Stalingrad, all of that was completely useless. The battle devolved into what the German soldiers themselves grimly started calling Rattenkrieg, the Rat War.
So what did the Rat War actually look like? Well, it was a savage, brutal, close-quarters fight. The battlefield wasn't measured in kilometers anymore. It was measured in single rooms, in stairwells, and factory workshops. The distance between the front lines was often just the thickness of a brick wall. Soviet defenders would use the city's sewer system to pop up behind the German lines, and snipers from both sides turned the landscape of rubble into a terrifying hunting ground.
The Soviet commander in the city, Vasily Chuikov, adapted to this new reality brilliantly. He came up with this desperate but incredibly clever tactic that he called hugging the enemy. He forced his troops to stay as physically close to the German positions as they possibly could. We're talking just meters away. This made it impossible for the German Luftwaffe to drop bombs or for their artillery to fire without a huge risk of hitting their own guys. It completely negated Germany's technological advantage and dragged them into the exact kind of bloody, attritional fight they were totally unprepared for.
All of this insane fighting really got concentrated around a few key strategic points, places that became these legendary symbols of the city's defense. First was Mamayev Kurgan, this huge hill that overlooked the whole city center. If you controlled the summit, you basically controlled the city, and it changed hands so many times it's hard to even count. The other main battleground was the massive industrial factory district in the north, this huge complex of steel and concrete workshops, the Red October steel plant, the Barakati arms factory, and the tractor plant, which were all turned into these giant, sprawling fortresses. And right in the middle of all this citywide chaos, you get these just incredible stories of resilience. Take this number, 58. That's the number of days that a single platoon of Soviet soldiers, led by a Sergeant Yakub Pavlov, defended one single four-story apartment building against constant, relentless German attacks. That building, which became known as Pavlov's house, was eventually marked on German tactical maps as a fortress. It became this powerful symbol of the stubborn, unbreakable defense of the whole city.
Okay, so while the German Sixth Army was literally bleeding to death in the streets of Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command, they were quietly looking at the much bigger map. Under brilliant strategists like Georgy Zhukov, they were preparing a massive, decisive, and very secret trap.
See, the Germans had made a critical mistake, a really, really big one. They had focused all their best troops, the elite Sixth Army, on the direct assault on the city. But to do that, they had to stretch their front line for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, and the vast northern and southern flanks of this attack weren't held by crack German troops. Oh no, they were held by their less experienced and much more poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. And that was the weak point the Soviets were about to hit with everything they had.
On November 19, 1942, the Soviets unleashed Operation Uranus. It was a classic, massive double pincer movement. From the north, a huge Soviet force just smashed right through the Romanian Third Army. A day later, from the south, another powerful pincer completely shattered the Romanian Fourth Army. The Soviet tank armies drove deep into the German rear. And then, on November 23rd, the two giant pincers met at the town of Kalach. In just 4 days, the trap had snapped shut.
And just like that, trapped inside this brand new pocket, or Kessel, as the Germans called it, were approximately 300,000 Axis soldiers. We're talking the entire German Sixth Army, parts of the 4th Panzer Army, and all their allied units. In one swift, brilliant operation, the hunters had suddenly and completely become the hunted.
And this brings us to the final, grim chapter of the battle. The fight for the city was basically over. Now, the fight for survival inside the frozen cauldron was just beginning. And the decisions that were made in the next few weeks, far, far away from the front lines, would seal the fate of 300,000 men.
I mean, this is the logical question, right? It's the one General Paulus and his commanders on the ground were all asking themselves. An immediate organized breakout attempt might have actually worked, even if it was at a terrible cost. So why did they just stay put? Why did they wait for a doom that seemed absolutely inevitable?
Well, the answer came directly from Hitler himself. From his headquarters way back in East Prussia, he absolutely forbade any breakout attempt. He ordered the Sixth Army to dig in and form a fortress, convinced that they were tying down huge numbers of Soviet forces. And crucially, he was convinced by Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, that the entire army could be supplied forever from the air.
But that promised air bridge, it was a catastrophic fantasy. Just look at the numbers. The Sixth Army needed, at a bare minimum, 750 tons of supplies every single day just to function. The Luftwaffe promised they could deliver 500. The actual average delivery? It was less than 100 tons a day. Soviet anti-aircraft fire, fighter planes, and the absolutely brutal Russian winter made every flight a potential suicide mission. The trapped army was doomed to starve, to freeze, and to slowly die as their ammunition and medical supplies just ran out.
From there, the end was just agonizing and inevitable. In December, a German relief attempt, called Operation Winterstorm, was launched, but it was beaten back. In January, the Soviets actually offered generous surrender terms, but Hitler forbade Paulus from accepting. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, which was this grim, cynical hint, because no German Field Marshal in history had ever surrendered. But Paulus chose to live. He surrendered his forces the very next day. And by February 2nd, 1943, the last pockets of German resistance in Stalingrad finally fell silent.
The guns fell silent in the city, but the consequences of this battle were just beginning to unfold. So now, let's turn to the aftermath and really understand why this one brutal battle truly had world-altering consequences.
The sheer scale of the human cost here it's just staggering. It's hard to even comprehend.
Total casualties for both sides in the wider campaign approached 2 million people, making it one of the absolute bloodiest battles in all of human history. For the Axis powers, the loss was total. An entire army, their most powerful and experienced army group, was just wiped off the map. Of the roughly 91,000 men who finally surrendered, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. It was a demographic and military catastrophe from which the German war effort on the Eastern Front would never, ever recover.
And the impact was immediate, and it was profound. On the battlefield, the strategic initiation, the momentum, it passed permanently to the Soviet Union. From this point on, it would be the Red Army on the attack, pushing the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Psychologically, it was a massive blow to German morale and a huge boost for the Allies everywhere. News of this incredible victory echoed around the globe, signaling for the very first time that Hitler was not invincible. And for the city of Stalingrad itself, the cost was near total annihilation, with 99% of it left in complete ruin.
And so we end here. This quote from historian Jeffrey Roberts really says it all. Stalingrad was not just another battle. It was a true hinge point of the 20th century. It was the place where the momentum of the Second World War fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. It was where the myth of Nazi invincibility died in frozen rubble, and where the terrible, grinding road to Berlin truly began. Thanks for joining this explainer.